A story of silence. But listen closely. Connecting minds. Connecting from Africa for the world.
I used to lead workshops on governance frameworks in West Africa. Yeah, I was that guy. PowerPoint slides, buzzwords, laminated handouts. We flew in, talked about transparency, decentralization, stakeholder alignment, flew out, the usual. Then one day, someone sent me a headline: 3-4-year-old army captain takes power in Burkina Faso. I rolled my eyes. Another coup, I said. That won't end well. Except, it kind of did. Fast forward 2 years. Vaccination rates are up, debt is down, gold stays in the country, and there's a national pharma lab exporting meds to neighbours. Meanwhile, I just got an email from my old NGO asking if I could update a report from 2019 that nobody read. That's when it hit me. What if we didn't teach resilience? What if we just translated poverty into English? Because while we were writing grant proposals and publishing glossy impact assessments, he was building things. No workshops, no waiting, just action. And if that doesn't rattle the expert in you, then maybe you haven't been honest about what expert means. We had a playbook, and he burned it. We said, partner with the West. He said, nah, I'll nationalize the mines. We said, fiscal discipline, microloans, slow and steady. He said, how about free school lunches for 2 million kids? And the craziest part, his version worked. Burkina Faso cut foreign debt exposure by 42% in less than 2 years. They kicked out the IMF, and yet somehow no collapse. They took over gold production, redirected profits straight into public infrastructure. They opened a government-run pharma lab in Ouagadougou that now supplies basic antibiotics across West Africa. No donor funding, no white papers, just results. I remember spending weeks designing community engagement frameworks. He built roads. I hosted roundtables on gender equity in education. He paid teachers on time in full. Look, I'm not saying coups are the answer. But I am saying, if the thing we call development needs 10 years to change a school lunch policy, and his undemocratic regime feeds 1 million kids before we finish a feasibility study, who really failed here? Maybe it's not about his shortcuts. Maybe it's about our detours. And if that stings, well, it probably should. Let me give you a number. $2.1 billion. That's how much foreign aid Burkina Faso received between 2000 and 2020, mostly from countries like mine. You'd think that kind of money would leave a visible mark, right? Well, before Traoré, over 70% of rural households still didn't have access to clean water. 1 in 4 children was chronically malnourished. Most medications were imported at triple the regional price, often expired by the time they arrived. But hey, we built plenty of project logos, designed infographics, published impact reports that nobody in Burkina Faso ever saw. Now flip to 2023, just 2 years into Traoré's rule. Malaria treatment coverage increased by 28%. Rural mobile clinics now reach areas NGOs didn't even try to map. A new public initiative provides subsidized fertilizer to small farmers direct, no middlemen. State-run grain banks keep prices stable during dry seasons. And all that? Done with national revenue, not donor dependency. Meanwhile, my former NGO just launched a year-long assessment study to explore the possibility of streamlining maternal health initiatives. That's code for we're still figuring it out. But Traoré? He's not figuring it out. He's just doing it. We said, evidence-based policy. He said, field-based urgency. And you know what's terrifying? He might actually be setting a better precedent. Because here's what's happening now. Other nations, Mali, Niger, Guinea, they're watching. And they're not seeing a dictator. They're seeing an alternative. Something leaner, cheaper, faster, local. And if that gains traction, then the whole Western aid industry might be the one facing a legitimacy crisis. Let that sink in. And if you've ever donated to an NGO, maybe ask them how many toilets they built. Here's the phrase we kept repeating in the aid world. Traoré's not legitimate. Why? Because he wasn't elected. Because he didn't pass the democracy test we wrote in English and expected everyone to memorize. But here's what we didn't ask. Legitimate to who? Because if you walk into a rural village in Burkina Faso right now, no one's quoting the Constitution. They're quoting the fact that they finally have a working well, a school that opened on time, a nurse that actually shows up. To them, legitimacy isn't ballots. It's results. And here's a hard stat to swallow. In 2015, with a functioning electoral system, Burkina Faso had over 150,000 internally displaced people due to conflict and poverty. By 2024, under Traoré without elections, displacement dropped by nearly 30%. Not because he gave great speeches, because he physically moved aid and food to where it was needed. Meanwhile, in countries we call fully democratic, food insecurity is rising, infrastructure crumbles. Bills get passed to protect pharma companies instead of patients. But hey, we have elections, right? That's the game. We confuse procedure with purpose. And we get mad when someone breaks the rules but delivers the goods. Because if a guy with no campaign, no PR team, no polished manifesto can still feed, build and protect better than we do, then maybe he's not the one lacking legitimacy. Maybe we are. Think on that. And if it burns a little, that's not by accident. Let's talk about France. For decades they had the Sahel on speed dial. Troops stationed, contracts signed, gold flowing west, debts flowing south, and we all kind of looked the other way because it was wrapped in words like security cooperation and development partnership. But Traoré? He cut the cord. Kicked out French soldiers, ripped up military agreements and told Paris, we're done. And here's the wild part. The country didn't collapse, it started breathing. Within 6 months of the French withdrawal, local defense units began patrolling zones foreign troops never entered. Armed conflict incidents in key regions dropped by 18%. The gold export tax was restructured, funneling revenue straight into Burkina Faso's public health fund. France, of course, didn't take it well. Media headlines screamed militarization, Russian influence, instability, as if the worst-case scenario was Africans deciding for themselves. It's funny, when France occupies, we call it assistance. When Africa resists, we call it chaos. But here's a stat no one put in the headlines. Traoré's public approval, measured in an independent regional survey, 68%, higher than any sitting European leader at the time. So let's be honest, maybe it's not instability that scares the West. Maybe it's independence, because for the first time in a long time, Burkina Faso isn't asking, it's acting. And the people who used to hold the remote, they're realizing the batteries are gone. If that unsettles you, you might want to ask why, and maybe ask what order really meant all along. You know what hit me hardest? It wasn't the numbers. Not the new schools or the free meds or even the gold contracts finally staying in Africa. It was the realization that Traoré is doing things we should be doing, and he's doing them with fewer resources, no international approval, and zero legacy institutions propping him up. Meanwhile, in the US, medical debt is the #1 cause of personal bankruptcy. Our teachers strike for pencils, our veterans sleep outside VA hospitals, and we still call ourselves the model. We critique others for not having functioning democracy, but forget we can't even pass basic gun legislation while kids keep dying in schools. So who's really stable? Who's really failing? That's when the mirror showed up, and I didn't like the reflection. Traoré made me realize something brutal. We don't fear instability abroad. We fear the proof that something else works better than what we've sold for decades. He's not just challenging systems over there. He's exposing cracks over here. Because if Burkina Faso can educate more children with a fraction of our budget, if they can produce medicine while we fight over insulin prices, if they can say no to empire and still stay standing, then what excuse do we have? We're not watching a dictator defy the odds. We're watching a system embarrass the ones who said it couldn't be done. And if that leaves you uncomfortable, it should. Because that discomfort, that's not about him, it's about us. Ron. Min salam lai ph and 7 voi muktrin kai so hun, datom tin hun, va vanzu dung fong do da thit lup to do. Do de la fian ban ching suamant. They keep calling it a breakdown, a failed state, a power vacuum, a fragile regime. But what if we've been reading it backwards? What if Burkina Faso under Traoré isn't crumbling, but prototyping? Because let's stop pretending this is an isolated glitch. In just 2 years, 3 countries, Mali, Niger and Burkina Faso, have cut ties with France. All 3 expelled foreign troops and suspended IMF-backed agreements. All 3 are building alternative trade routes that bypass colonial ports. Joint military operations, shared infrastructure deals, and cross-border food programs are already underway. And here's the part no one wants to print. It's working. The narrative said they'd implode. But inflation is stabilizing, school attendance is up, access to basic services is rising across rural zones long ignored by both NGOs and national capitals. And guess what? People are noticing. Senegalese activists are quoting Traoré's speeches. Pan-African youth groups are forming sovereignty camps. Even diaspora networks in Europe are rethinking what agency means. This isn't just anti-West, it's post-West. It's a generation saying, we're not interested in symbolic independence anymore, we want the keys. And what terrifies the old system most is that this isn't ideological, it's functional. They're not building utopias, they're building pharmacies, grain reserves, solar panels, truck depots, things that move, feed, heal, work. Things we said required decades, consultants, elections, donors, think tanks. They did it in 2 years, with a military guy in dusty boots, without a single Davos invite. So let me say it plainly. If that's collapse, maybe collapse is what progress looks like, when the empire no longer writes the definition. And if you're still waiting for the old order to bounce back, you might already be living in the past. We came to help. That's always been the story, right? We brought textbooks, training modules, strategic frameworks. We held conferences on empowerment and published op-eds about resilience. But what if we were the ones in need? Because while we were handing out policy papers, Traoré was handing out antibiotics. While we debated democracy indexes, he tripled school lunch coverage in one of the poorest regions on earth. And here's the uncomfortable part. He did it without us. No approval, no applause, no permission, just results. So now we're staring at a version of leadership that doesn't look like ours, but works. And that raises a brutal question. If you had to choose between someone who delivers speeches and someone who delivers food, who would you really trust? And before you answer, ask yourself why you need to hesitate. Because maybe we're not uncomfortable with Traoré because he's dangerous. Maybe we're uncomfortable because he makes us look ineffective. For decades, we sold ourselves as the architects of modern governance. We trained leaders, wrote constitutions. Now one man breaks every rule and outperforms every blueprint we handed out. So who's failing who? That's not a rhetorical question. That's your reflection. And if you've made it this far, here's the real call to action. Don't just debate this, own it. Of this challenge what you thought you knew, say so. Drop your take, comment, push back, or hit subscribe if you think the empire deserves a second opinion. Because maybe it's not about saving the global south anymore. Maybe it's about finally saving ourselves.